all possibilities. Every direction has a new place to see and a new thing to do. But why is it every single game nowadays? How has this mindset been the primary one? Not just the primary one, but the overwhelming majority of games are made like this now. And that makes me sound old, I know. Sometimes a full-blown narrative that has a definite beginning, middle, and end is a good thing. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today GameRanks asks the question, why do some gamers miss more linear games? So let me just start this right out by saying it's not necessarily an age thing that I'm talking about today. While some are definitely predisposed to the nostalgia of how things used to be, and that's certainly an ongoing conversation that we all really need to have, because it's linking us to some pretty unsavory stuff. We're getting a little bit obsessed, but I'm not talking about this from that perspective. In fact, I have no interest whatsoever in that version of this argument. I want to talk about game design. Virginia is a controversial game, but in the sense that it's a storm within a teacup. Only a few people really care about it all that much. But this game isn't about that stuff, it's about a narrative, a specific linear narrative. Now it's told in a fairly non-linear way in the format of some of the more popular mindfuck style movies from the 90s, but you don't really have any input, you don't have choice that really changes things. And when I got through with Virginia, though I was very confused for a few minutes as I took the time to digest what I just witnessed, I was satisfied. I wasn't prompted for any microtransactions to continue some sort of an endless statistics grind that would constitute continuing the experience, so to speak, and I was transported back to something I don't really think about that often, the ending of a game. And while we all get to the end of a lot of narrative games nowadays, in many ways games encourage us a great deal to continue to play. And in some ways it's important that a game be able to be played after you've reached the narrative ending of the story. But the other thing is how interesting it is that games have taken a direction where a story isn't necessarily the primary thing that we want out of a game anymore. Take, for instance, Bloodborne. Narrative elements have been sort of sprinkled throughout the game in the form of clues or general lore tokens, whatever you want to call them, in ways that we sort of find out about what's happened in the world up to that point, sort of filling out a backstory as we go through a long climb to the sort of highest level that we can get to. We aren't given a lot of direction, we aren't given a lot of requirements, and this is in games that do have a narrative still. Never mind how many games have become completely open-ended sandbox experiences that have no narrative whatsoever. Minecraft and its various successors spring to mind in that regard, but even, let's say, Grand Theft Auto, if you wanted to ignore the story, you'd be able to. You can just do whatever you want, essentially. And there's nothing bad about that. In fact, that's great. It's freaking phenomenal. It's amazing where we are. When I think about the fact that we're able to do that in a video game, when we're able to simulate experiences in an open-ended and essentially endless manner, that's amazing. But there's also something to be said for a game like Super Mario Bros., where there's a start, some obstacles, and an end. And within the experience of the series, there's hundreds of those. A lot of discussions used to be, have you beaten that game? Whereas now the equivalent is, what level are you? What are your stats? And in many respects, that's a better conversation, in all honesty. It's a more detailed conversation that's much more likely to generate discussion. It's open-ended, just like what we've been talking about. Whereas have you beaten it is a yes or no question. Certainly the idea that our discussions are more gray area oriented is far more interesting to me. But at the same time, oftentimes a vision, a truly great story that you might have some limited input on or no input on is just as good of an experience, and sometimes better. Can you imagine if games like Final Fantasy VI were never made? Like, say Chrono Trigger was just that battle system and the ability to travel back and forth in time on that planet. You met other players who were also doing the same thing and maybe socialized. And keep in mind, I'm saying that is the game that happened instead of Chrono Trigger, because frankly that game doesn't sound bad. I would love that game. Give me that game, in fact. I would love to have an MMORPG that has the 90s Square active time battle system. That would be great. I would love that, but not in place of the games and their narratives. That's kind of the situation that we're having today. Games like Metal Gear Solid have always been strong narrative experiences. Very strange ones, but still. And in the latest one, a lot of the narrative content was cut as they put in more online content. And now they're even making a ridiculous open world survival zombie game because we don't have enough of those. We need to tarnish the Metal Gear Solid name with it. Thanks, Konami. And we're gradually gearing our experiences towards these endless, free-to-play-esque statistics battles. Who has the most stuff and points? Do you have that unit? I have that unit. Ha ha ha! And ultimately, this creates competitive scenarios that can't deliver the same emotional through lines that a good narrative can. And often, the competitive element is fostered specifically to facilitate the consumption of digital goods. That's just not something a game with a definitive beginning and end, whether it be through narrative like a Final Fantasy title or through game design like Super Mario Bros., can really offer without seeming very forced. Now, I really want to stress that I don't mean that linear is good and non-linear is bad. I'm never going to say anything that means that, because there is so much linear crap. And there's so much expansive, amazing experiences that completely break all barriers. But as we start to call games art more and more, and believe me, that is a mainstream thing at this point, we have to keep in mind that art is sometimes about the artist and about what they think and they feel. A linear game is very much that. That's not to say there isn't participatory art. If you ask me, World of Warcraft is as much art as Journey, and both of those are participatory games, albeit very different experiences, one incredibly linear and one open-ended entirely. And in truth, experiences that some consider very linear may not really be that linear. For instance, Dishonored. It's a game that has a very definitive beginning, middle, and end, but it gives you a lot of choice as to how you do it. And I'm sure somebody will argue that, but the thing is everything is relative. It's subjective. I'm interested in good writing. I'm interested in good voice acting, in good characterization, in good world building. And I'm also very interested in how well somebody is able to tell a story. You may not be interested in all of those things or any of those things. You may be interested in video games entirely for a mechanical element. A real brain buster for you here, though, is that Super Mario Bros., the game I keep bringing up as a very linear game, doesn't really have a story. It's all mechanics. And I think the reason why a lot of people say they miss linear games isn't necessarily because they crave a narrative. A lot of non-linear games actually present you with quite a narrative. The Grand Theft Auto 5 narrative is actually pretty elaborate for what it is. So if I've just deconstructed my entire argument, why the hell do people miss linear games? And I'm gonna go ahead and say I think it's because linear games just don't get a lot of attention. They're not marketed as experiences the way that an open-ended thing like No Man's Sky is. And the thing is, people really wanted No Man's Sky to be what it was marketed as. You can see it in their sales numbers. But I think if games that had a definitive ending were marketed a little bit more heavily, like a game with a good ending hyped as having a good ending, like BioShock Infinite was, or a game with rich story elements that guides you through a very definitive story, like say Oxenfree got a lot of attention, or hell, if editors lost their shit over Sonic Mania the way Sonic fans did, I think people wouldn't be like, I miss linear games. Because there are linear games, they still exist. We're just hellbent on pretending that that's not video games. A constant discussion people have in video games is about immersion, and people often mistake immersion for choice. But that's not really what immersion means. Immersion means you feel like you're invested, that things matter, that this affects you. And that doesn't mean necessarily that it's a sandbox and that anything I can dream up I can do. A lot of the time that means I'm really interested in the story, or this racing game is really good at making me feel the sensation of speed. And that doesn't necessitate choice. And when you see me playing Super Mario Bros., I'm always leaning into it and moving around. I'm immersed. And it's not because I can choose my destination. There's a flag to the right, and I'm running towards it. If I run away from it, nothing happens. I'm a person who likes both ends of this spectrum. A linear game can be as good, if not better, than a non-linear game, and vice versa. But I feel like we heap our attention too much on one of these things, like that's the only thing it should be. We're in one camp or the other. And in all honesty, that's a big problem in almost every one of the subjects we could cover in video games. People are drawing lines in the sand over things that make no sense to do that over. I miss linear games because it's harder for me to find linear games because they aren't marketed as much. I don't know about you, but I have a feeling there's more than a few people that feel the same way. If you have something to add, I feel like we could probably continue this discussion for hours, and I'd be very interested to read what you have to say, so go ahead down in the comments section and leave like 8 or 9 paragraphs on this subject, please. It's due Monday, or